medic. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a newspaper reporter. I spent my life producing food. I was an executive of Northern Foods for 12 years or so. And I left Northern Foods about 20 years ago to start running a family business, not mine, somebody else's, and grew that family business from an £80 million turnover business to an 800 million turnover business when I retired in 2012. What does that mean? I grew the business by £250,000 a day for 17 years. And I received an MBE in 2014 for my work in the community and my business success. Now, why do I say that? I say that because I've never said it before in a presentation, and I don't say it for my ego, and I don't say it to try and pat myself on the back. I say it because I knew I was presenting to some people who are medics. And whenever I have told a medic why I'm involved in this, I am severely electrically sensitive. I am regarded as a nutcase. Believe me, you're regarded as a nutcase. So I hope by telling you those things, I give you an idea. I'm not. And I've had to fight the retailers in the UK very, very sensibly and have good relationship with retailers and human beings and be able to wake people up of when they're telling the truth and not, to be able to achieve that success. And although David G should have been here presenting to you late lessons and early warnings, and it was primarily about other factors other than EMF, what I want to do is just concentrate on one of his slides and tell you my personal experience of what is involved in being electrically sensitive and my personal experiences of some of these things. As an executive of Northern Foods and the chief exec of Sandwith Brothers, the business that I ran, I was looking after many businesses dotted around the UK. And that meant travelling lots of miles, and you always felt guilty of not being in communication with people when you were on the road, when you were travelling. So I spent most of my life travelling in my car on my mobile phone. And I did this for 12 years or so, and no problems, no issues with travelling around using a mobile phone to my head, because in those days you start off hands-free, but invariably what you found that after a period of time you couldn't hear people, so you picked it up and you put it to your head. And I was not aware, this is in the late 90s, that there was a problem with mobile phones. Everybody told me it was perfectly safe, it's not an issue at all, and I believed that. Why would anybody lie? And then in my last year of using a mobile phone, in the year 2000, I started to experience some quite weird sensations. And to cut a long story short, by the end of about 12 months, I was experiencing excruciating pain when I put my mobile phone to my head. And like an idiot, I was still believing the Health Protection Agency telling us that, no, it's perfectly safe, and if there's any issues, it's just short term, it's not a problem, don't worry about it. Until one day, when I put the mobile phone to my head for the last time, it was almost as if my eardrum had burst. The pain was so bad. And when I say it was related to the mobile phone, because people try to confuse this debate, I mean it was my mobile phone. No pain, pain. No pain, pain. It was as dramatic as that. And for a period of time, I used, or tried to use, the earpiece that you use with the wire. Complete waste of time. doesn't help whatsoever. The pain was still, if the mobile phone was there and I had the earpiece on my ear, it was exactly the same experience. Significant pain. So I was trying to turn the earpiece the other way to keep it away from my ear. Didn't make any difference. So in 2000, in September of 2000, when it felt as though my eardrum had burst, I recognised that I was a freak, that everybody else was perfectly okay and it was not an issue, but for me, there was something the matter with my system. I couldn't use a mobile phone. Now, running a UK business with the major retailers is difficult enough. Running it when you can't use a mobile phone and speak to people when you're on the road is even more difficult. But it actually, I would argue, it helped with the success of the business because I spent my life talking to people rather than emailing people. And what I found as I started to do my own little bit of research as to why this has happened to me, I found an enormous amount of research showing some of the effects that I was having was being proved, peer-reviewed research showing why this happened. And what I found was that what people were trying to do desperately was to disconnect the research from people who were becoming electrically sensitive. Because if you put the two together, you actually have a fairly convincing set of evidence of what is happening. But if you can keep it apart, you can rubbish these people who claim to be electrically sensitive because it's psychosomatic and it's a load of rubbish. And you can then just attack the scientists that are producing the research showing that there is a problem. And in the UK and around the world, they've done a brilliant job. And I then got involved in the Radiation Research Trust because of the things that the research that I was seeing, not about electrical sensitivity, but about other things, about cancer, about senile dementia, about fertility and so on and so forth. And was astonished at the brick walls that were put in place to make sure that this was not treated seriously.
Brian, can I interrupt? I've put my laptop and my mobile on plane mode. Can I use my laptop with that?
Everybody else is, so don't worry about it.
Right.
Carry on. And as I became involved with the Radiation Research Trust and ES UK, who's chaired by Michael Beverton, I had lots of interest from people wanting to interview me because I was this lunatic who was electrically sensitive and refused to be interviewed because I thought that this is far too sensitive. I have some credibility with the retailers, the chief execs who I knew personally, and this might destroy my credibility. And then after a period of time, when I saw more and more and more research came out, I started to feel quite guilty. Because if somebody like me is not prepared to speak up and explain what is going on, how will I feel in 20 years' time when people are dying of cancer, dying of senile dementia, having fertility problems, and somebody like me was not prepared to shout up? So I actually was the first person in the UK to go into a national newspaper, The Telegraph, to talk about electrical sensitivity, and it was treated reasonably sensitively by the newspaper. And it involved a number of radio interviews with Jill Meara, the Health Protection Agency, where in the first interview all these people were nutcases. In the second interview she was saying we need to do a bit more research in this area, and in the third interview she actually said we need to do something to help these people who are electrically sensitive. So I felt, job done, they're going to start treating this seriously. And what I didn't realise was treating it seriously was how do we find a better way to rubbish these people that claim to be electrically sensitive. And as a result of that, having sort of disappeared for 12 months or so. I then did a second article in the Mail talking about what the future will hold. Cancer, senile dementia, fertility problems. This will be a disaster of a magnitude that people do not comprehend. And as it happens, that interview, that newspaper actually got me an interview with Sir William Stewart. But I'll talk about that in a second. Because before that, what I did was I got involved with the Essex University, who were doing a study on whether electrical sensitivity existed or not. And I went along like a fool, thinking these were honourable people, and they were doing some serious research to find out whether people were electrically sensitive or not. And I had quite a debate with the individuals involved with doing the research, because one, I wanted to know how they vetted the people who claimed to be electrically sensitive. No vetting. People walk through that door, claim to be electrically sensitive, they're electrically sensitive. Yeah, but what if a number of people from the mobile phone industry come in saying they're electrically sensitive? You know, that might damage your results. And they looked at me as if I had two heads. This is the research, take it or leave it. I also explained to them that I was severely electrically sensitive, and I was quite frightened of going into a room, double blind, with a mast. And if I had to pull out, would my results be taken account of? And I was assured that they would be. And I then asked them, would it be possible, because the way they did the research was very clever. The mast was going to be on twice and off once. And I asked them, could you reverse that and have it on once and off twice? Because the statistical significance is exactly the same. But if I'm severely electrically sensitive and I'm affected on the first occasion, I might not want to go in the second time because I'll be affected. This is the research, take it or leave it to you. So after annoying these people for a little while, asking questions, my final question was, what's the level of EMFs that I'm going to be exposed to? Give me a feel for this, because I am severely electrically sensitive. And the researchers didn't know. They had to go and start making a few phone calls so they could give me an idea. And before they came back to me, it was like, okay, I'll go ahead with it. I'll do this. So I signed up, I signed my rights away, and I took part in the research. And what they did was they wanted you to go in for half an hour, and the mast was going to be on twice and off once in 10-minute slots. And they wanted me to identify the 10-minute slots. And I said, I can't do that. I think you misunderstand how this affects people. I know I will be affected, but I won't tell you which 10 minutes it was on and which 10 minutes it was off. It's a bit like hay fever. If you take somebody to a wheat field and they have a reaction, and then you blindfold them and take them away, they don't go, oh, well, you've taken me away, because the effects are there. And sometimes with my hay fever, it'll last for a day or 2 days. It just doesn't stop. And it's the same with EMFs. Did they want to listen? No, not at all. This is the test. Take it or leave it. So I went away and did the 30-minute slots, 10, 10, 10, and came out at the end of it and said, well, I know it's been on, I can feel it, but I couldn't tell you, identify, as I'd said, which 10 minutes it was on, which 10 minutes was off. Fine, that's okay, just put that here. And then you went away for a week and you came back for 3 successive weeks, and you were then put in this Faraday cage for an hour a time, actually 50 minutes each time. And it was double blind, so whether it was on or off. On the first occasion that I went in, they finished it after 50 minutes. They were taking your pulse and your heart rate and so on and so forth. So it looked scientific. And at the end of it, they asked you, well, was the mast on or off? And I said, well, I would be 60 to 70% certain that the mast was on, but I know I'll be 100% certain in a few hours' time, because this is how it affects me. Right, okay, well, that's okay, because what we do is we give you these forms to fill in, and then you come back in a week's time with all the forms filled in as the effects that you've had for this test. I filled the forms in when I went home. By the time I got home, I was in serious distress. Serious distress. I was having quite serious heart palpitations, and I had serious pains in my gut. When I got home, I went to the toilet, and I was pouring with blood. And I don't mean a little bit of blood. I mean I was pouring with blood. And I mean that any other normal human being who wasn't electrically sensitive would have gone to hospital straight away. But when you're electrically sensitive, you don't bother. It's not worth it. So I bled for about 10 days. And I rang up the study the following day and explained what had happened to me and how badly I was affected, and pulled out because I could not conceive of going back the following week and doing the same thing again, and how it would affect me, because the problem, it was the worst experience I've ever had, and it went on for a long period of time. But I filled in the forms, and I literally, on my form, put on there, discomfort in bowel, blood in stool, slight internal trembling, muscle pain, chest pains reacting much more severely than ever before near computers or TV, difficulty breathing. I'm now concerned I have seriously made my condition worse by doing the test, would stake my life, quite literally, on the fact that the mask was on. That's how certain I was. And I got my results from them 6 months later. Yes, correct. I had identified that the mask was on, but as a result of not completing the tests, all my results would be ignored. I went on radio and television when the study results came out some months later to say what a farce it was, and I think that I then got a letter from Elaine Fox, who was in charge of the study. And she wanted to release all my information to the press. I rang her up and told her, yeah, very happy that you release my information to the press, so long as you release it all. What do you mean release it all? Well, you know, the back paper, the papers, the papers that you gave us to fill in. What papers we gave you to fill in? She said. Well, you actually gave us papers to fill in for the following week. Didn't know anything about it. All we want to do is release your first 10-minute slots where you said you couldn't tell the difference. I said, well, no, I don't agree to that. I'm happy that you release all my information as long as you release all the information. I told her what had happened to me, and it was on the information that I sent back, recorded delivery, and she said to me, that's not possible. And I said, well, sorry, I don't understand this. I thought you were doing research to find out what was possible. Had you already made your mind up what was possible? She put the phone down on me. And research since then has shown that even with that test that was done, there was a difference between the sham and the people who claimed to be electrically sensitive. And the reason that I'd asked for a person, how did they vet these people? I help people who are electrically sensitive, and I'd helped somebody in Nottingham only a few months before. And this lady had lots of medical issues, but she was not electrically sensitive, but she thought she was. And I explained to her in a partner that she wasn't electrically sensitive, but she has some major medical problems. And she had signed up for the Essex study to find out if she was electrically sensitive. Well, what a farce. She wasn't electrically sensitive, but she'd signed up, and they would, because she walked through the door and claimed to be electrically sensitive, she was allowed. Anyway, and what I found over the following years was all the research that came out of Russia. It showed that people were electrically sensitive and it caused cancer and so on and so forth, and couldn't quite understand this. You know, how can a communist country be telling its people that electrical sensitivity exists and it causes cancer, and our democracy is actually hiding the fact? Oh, how naive I was. Oleg Grigoriev came and presented a couple of years ago to the Radiation Research Trust with all the Russian research, and we'd invited the Health Protection Agency and some MPs. None of them turned up. The newspapers, none of them turned up. what relevance was Russian research to the UK? But what Oleg said was that the World Health Organization had ignored their research. And they'd ignored their research because it was printed in Russian. The only research that they took notice of was that was published in English. So Oleg, and it's on the radiation research website, the interview, asked the World Health Organization would they like the Russians to translate the 20 or 30 most important papers in this area into English for them so they can use it in their consideration. And the World Health Organization said they didn't want it. And we asked him, why do you think that was? And then he refused to answer, he just shrugged his shoulders. Because he knew why they didn't want to see the Russian research. Because the Russian research would make fools of ICNIRP, etc. And in Russia and in the early days, it wasn't called electrical sensitivity, it was called microwave sickness. And it's probably a more apt description. And the Russian presentation that he made was basically saying what they are seeing is that this EMFs are attacking the central nervous system, and it's an indirect mechanism that's causing the cancer. And it's a little bit at odds with other people who've done research and have other different mechanisms. And I would argue very strongly that probably all these mechanisms are correct. This is not simple. All these theories that people are coming up with have some validity in the methodology of causing cancer. And I was on the radio, the World BBC World Service, with a gentleman by the name of Per Sergebeck. Per Sergebeck was one of the researchers who did work on the mobile phone in the early days, and he found that there was lots of the researchers that were becoming electrically sensitive, and they helped them to do the research. They shielded their houses, they shielded their rooms, and then when the marketeers became in charge of the mobile phone industry because of its success, all the people who were electrically sensitive were fired. And those of you who will have seen Sir William Stewart's report and have read it will know that although the press made out to give an okay to this research, that it, on the balance of evidence which it says it's safe, there is so many caveats in this report. It's a reasonably balanced report, but all the bits of balance are ignored. And it's just the one-line sentence that they want to use. And what we've seen more recently is other countries, as Erica has shown, reducing the limits, and as a result of reducing the limits, taking legal action against people that exceed them. And there was the case of power frequencies around the radio station in Rome, where there was hotspots of cancer. And it went to court, it went to the Supreme Court in Italy, and the Supreme Court in Italy ruled that the hotspots were caused by EMFs. Sadly, the issue is still contentious and is still not resolved, because the masts that were irradiating the people were not in Italy. They were in the Vatican. And the Vatican said it's not possible. And they had God on their side. So it's still not resolved, and those people have still not received compensation. But because the limits have been lowered in some countries, the courts can actually start to seriously look at the issues. Whereas in the UK, when the levels are up here, there's no need to look at it, because they're so safe in the UK versus the other countries that have lower limits. How can that be possible? And we've also seen now a gentleman in Italy go to the Supreme Court and have his brain tumour on the balance of probability caused by his mobile phone. And the reason that they ruled on that was because the company had taken away the possibility of him using a landline. So he had no choice other than to use a mobile phone. And what is happening now in the UK, and I think PwC have just announced they're going to do away with landlines. So everybody will become automatically a heavy mobile phone user, because there will be no landlines there. And there was, in 2000, T-Mobile asked a university to do some research into the effects of mobile phones. And the research that they produced is very much like the research that you're now seeing from yourselves and from the MTP, showing cancer, showing all kinds of problems, all the problems that the Russians had found, and it's all in this report. And it was never published. And this was then leaked by an employee of T-Mobile to the press. And T-Mobile were challenged by the press. Why have you not released this? Why have you not told people about the dangers? Have you not taken this seriously? And their answer was, we've taken this very, very seriously. So seriously that what we've done is we've gone to a different university and asked them the same question. And they've come back with everything's okay. And that's how it works. You know which universities to go to. And after 20 or 30 years, you now know exactly which universities you need to go to and how to conduct the experiments to make sure there's not a problem. But not every country is like that. So if you read what has happened in Switzerland, they actually say it has been scientifically established that intensive non-ionizing radiation is harmful to our health, but certain biological effects also occur at exposure levels well below internationally recommended limits. And this is how you need to protect yourself, and this is how we, the government, will help to protect you. And this is 2000. So, for an awful long time, some countries have been aware that there's major problems. Michael Beverton has produced a paper with thousands of research literature showing why plants, animals and human beings are electrically sensitive. The Bioinitiative report explains exactly the same. This is an old one, but it explains all the research. But how did the Public Health England deal with this in the UK? How do they spread misinformation? Because I've had lectures with people and told them about this, and the answer that's come back to me is, oh yeah, but it's not peer reviewed. None of the research is peer reviewed, which is absolute nonsense. But what the Public Health England have said is it's not peer reviewed. Every single study in there is peer reviewed, but what they have complained about is that each chapter, one chapter on cancer, with lots of studies, that chapter has not been peer reviewed. All the scientific literature is peer reviewed, but the chapter's not been peer reviewed. So people then interpret that as none of it's peer reviewed. And I've been told by some physicists, oh, they've read this, and it's junk science. Because they've taken what the Public Health England have said about it's not peer reviewed as literal, that the science is not peer reviewed. Not true. I promise you, Eric, I'll wind up in a second. So, what we tried to do in the Radiation Research Trust is we tried to find an angle that we could go out into the press or post a campaign. And what we found was that most of the research that was showing harm at that stage was the fertility research. 80% of the research was showing that there's major problems with fertility in Wi-Fi environment. So what we did was we produced this. Your future is in your hands. The gentleman with his mobile phone in his pocket. And all these posters went up above male urinals in London. And somebody complained. So we were asked, could we substantiate this by the Advertising Standards Authority? They wanted to know what was their research to prove this. So we sent them all the papers, all the scientific papers, 80% of them showing scientific validity for what we claimed. And they ruled against us. And they ruled against us on the basis that that scientific literature was not generally accepted in the UK. So they want to see the science, and when they get it, no, we don't believe you. And likewise, we've done similar kind of things subsequently, where we went out with another poster campaign along service stations and places across the UK. And nobody could complain about that, because it's true. 1950s, Department of Health said there's no evidence cigarettes damage your health. 1960s, Department of Health says there's no evidence asbestos damages your health. 2016, Department of Health says there's no convincing evidence radiation from mobile phones damages your health. So what can they complain about? Your choice. But what people find, and the EHS UK have found, even though they produce literature and poster campaigns with lots of scientific evidence to show it's valid, be it the Advertising Standards Authority or the Press Complaints Committee, they all rule against us. And as I said, my presentation would go on for hours, but it won't. One of the reporters that should have been here today but didn't want to come because the NTP is only studied on rats. What relevance does that have to human beings? Was the science reporter for the Telegraph. And I just remind people of why we are in this problem with not only the government ridiculing all the research, but the newspapers not interested in this area. How do you look at it, yes? What you find now is that today's the day when we don't cover it. It's all about other things. What you find in the newspapers is 50% of all media advertising in the UK now is sponsored by the mobile phone industry. So if you've got people who want to write reports in our major papers, let's see one or two here. You've got people at a very senior level who are actually intimidated by the industry, and they're making enormous sums of money out of this in the same way that the government is. So not only do you have the government is biased because they're making too much money, the newspapers are biased because they're making too much money, and most of the people that you talk to these days are, half of them, involved in this industry and making their livings by it. So I'll now shut up because I'm going to talk to. As I said, my presentation will probably take 3 days. But hopefully you get the gist of what is happening to people who actually find that there are problems with the science and problems with becoming electrically sensitive, and why the newspapers, the government and everybody else doesn't want to listen. Thank you very much.